Thank you for joining the Janice Oasis. I'm Nola Simon. I'm your host, and this is a solo episode about influencing without authority. And if you actually think of it, no matter who you are, there's always areas of your life where you're actually not the authority. So you may be in charge at work, but when you show up at the school, you're a parent. You're not in charge. An example, I influence my husband's business, but it's his business. I'm not in charge, but I'm very influential in that business because we discuss decisions that he makes. And so there's always aspects of your life where you have to exercise the skill on how to actually influence without actually being the authority. And one of the easiest ways is really just to have stakeholder buy-in. So, for example, if you are at work and you're not actually the boss, but you really want to achieve something, you have a vision for a project or a way of helping your team members that could be helpful and very useful in the future, you can often get your manager on board and get support from senior management so that you can actually do the project. I did this once with training staff on how to actually use new webinar software and taught them best practices about how to run webinars. During the pandemic, I'm sure that they were grateful for that preview of how to actually function remotely. So it's something that is easier to do if you actually have a stakeholders that are going to support you. So it is more difficult if you're trying to make a change and you don't actually have support. For example, I once changed the lice policy for my school district because the school had sent home my kids 7 times reporting that they had lice. At that point, they didn't actually have lice, they had dandruff, but the parent volunteer kept misdiagnosing it. And so it actually was causing a problem because I was having to take time off work consistently. And there's only so much time you can take off before your employer starts to get very upset. So when I complained, they told me that there was nothing I could do about it because that was the policy. Yeah, there's always something that you can do about it. So like waving a red flag to a bull. And I got that policy changed. It may have taken me 18 months, but I went up the change. I worked the hierarchy. I learned how policies and procedures are designed. I learned best practices around the world. I leaned into help from strangers, and I got that policy changed. And so now, although the children do have to be treated if they actually do develop a case of lice, they can't be sent home for no knit policies because the impact on their mental health, not to mention the impact on the caregiver who has to take time off work, far exceeds the nuisance. And it's not a health issue. It's just really it's not a public health issue. It's just really a nuisance of having to treat the lice. So that impacted 180,000 kids. No one knows that I did that. And it's something that influences the experience of school for honestly thousands of kids, and they have no idea that I did that. I didn't have any authority to do that. I just worked the system to be able to make that change. And honestly, I did that same change when my mother was sick with dementia. I didn't have power of attorney. My dad had that, but my dad doesn't handle situations like that. English is not his first language, and also he panics. So I had to convince the medical team that they really needed to discuss her care with me prior to actually talking to my father to be able to make sure that she got the best care possible. And I did the same thing. I enlisted somebody who knew how the system worked. She explained to me how the hierarchy worked, how to get credibility and support. And I ended up actually having her entire medical team in a room with us. And all I really did was allow my father to talk. And that was sufficient to have the medical team determine that of the two of us, I was the better advocate. So sometimes it's what you don't actually do. You allow people to be who they are, and people will determine that you're the better option. And that can actually be a strategic approach as well, too. Sometimes you're not the best option. So sometimes it's actually better for you to step back and allow somebody else to talk. I did this a couple of different times at work where I had a friend of mine that the person that we were working with really preferred. And it was really just a preference, and we were both very good in our job, but there was a distinct preference. And so we needed to make a change, and I had her deliver the message. And because it came from her, even though it was my idea, it, it was adopted because it mattered who delivered the message, right? So you still make the achievement, you still get what you need to accomplish, you get that done. Does it really matter who delivers the message? It matters who delivers the message, but in terms of who owns that, it doesn't sometimes matter because the important thing is what you're trying to achieve. So that can be a real strategic advantage if you can actually shelve your ego long enough to actually allow somebody else to step in and actually run with something. So that's something to consider as well. How do you actually influence when you have no authority? I had a situation once where the client was having a difficult problem with their advisor, who happened to actually be a state senator. She had no influence. She had no power. I'm not even American, so I definitely had no power. But what we really did, it took years, was we talked really about what her powers really were. Because often people have more influence than they realize. And so eventually she was able to fire him. And she fired him from everything, except obviously his state senate job. So sometimes you really have to take the long perspective and really look long term and figure out how you put the pieces together in a way that's going to build the structure that you need to get to where you want to end up. So it's not something that's going to be a quick fix. It's a long-term influence. And again, a lot of times, sometimes this happens in the background where people don't even know that you're actually doing it. Another situation that happened at work too, where I was called, and what we actually ended up doing was rescuing a department that had been set up to create remote relationship support, but they were having difficulty getting buy-in and getting anybody to actually use their services. So I was called because I have instincts on how to run remote. I know what the relationship manager job is and what the benefits are. But I also, the person who called me, you also know how to get things done that nobody else knows how to get things done. And that's that skill of influencing without authority. And what we really ended up doing is assessing how people would even know about their team. And so it really came down to how the users were really being told about the team and how there was information on our knowledge management site, but like, why would anybody ever look it up? So it became a thing that we actually had to put in front of staff and actually added into their task list so that they were making proactive calls. In order to make those calls and be prepared for those calls, we had to research what the team was. And so it allowed the staff to get familiar enough with what the team was actually able to accomplish and what services they offered, so that when other scenarios came up, they would remember to make that suggestion and do the referrals. And that rescued an entire team and honestly set up the company for remote relationship management during the pandemic. And again, these things sometimes take years. You don't necessarily know what the future is going to bring. You have a vision for what it is you want to accomplish now and what that looks like in the future. And sometimes you have to imagine where you want to be in the future and then work your way backwards to what steps you really need to take to get to where you need to be in the future. And that's called backcasting. I didn't know there was actually an official term for it. So much of this stuff I actually do by instinct. And so futures thinking training has really allowed me to add the specific language in to make it more concrete. So those are examples of influencing with authority, without authority. And everybody has to do that. So how do you get things done when you can't just say, I need you to do it because I'm the boss? That's really the skill that we're talking about. And that's honestly what a part of this podcast is. I'm influencing what I want people to consider about the future of work, what hybrid remote looks like, what culture can look like. And we're really just talking about it. And I'm bringing guests on to really talk about the topics that I think help us build towards a more positive and concrete future of work. And it's really just ideas that we're talking about. And the more that I bring in people who have their own credibility, their own expertise, we're painting a picture of what that future of work could be. And when you listen to the podcast altogether, or even the content that I create around the podcast, I'm really influencing perceptions on what that future of work can be. I don't have the authority to determine the future. Nobody does, right? But the more we create discussion, we have the ability to influence. And that's really what the goal is. So hopefully that helps you think about influencing without authority in a different way. I personally think that it is one of the skills that is going to be in the most demand in the future because nobody's going to be in charge of everything all at once. So if you can really increase your ability to strategically position yourself to make change and drive change without actually having to be a people manager, or even if you are a people manager, but you're in a matrix organization and your line of power really is unbalanced, so you can influence the one side just because you're in authority, but then you have a second team where you don't know them as well and they don't respect you as much, you have to influence without authority. So there's lots of different ways that this can be used. And I think that it's one of these skills that's going to be in the most demand for the future of work. So hopefully that helps. And I'd love to hear your thoughts as always. Discussion is always good. That's how we drive change. Thanks for listening.